Hi folks, we're going to call this Persuasion Fast Foundations. I'm going to hopefully give you a little bit of the parameters around persuasive speaking and some of the key pieces to building an argument. So hopefully this supplements the reading that you've been doing in the OER, but certainly shouldn't replace the additional reading. So here we go, Persuasion Fast Foundations. So to get started, let's define persuasion. On the right-hand side, I have photographs of one man who some of you may recognize, both his fictional depiction and his real-life depiction, Jordan Belfort, who was played by Leonardo DiCaprio in the movie The Wolf of Wall Street. And I'm going to leave that here for a moment while we talk about what persuasion is, and then I'll come back to it. So our definition of persuasion is convincing your audience through open and honest means. And that open and honest piece may sound very, very simplistic, but it is a pivot point and a hinge that real, authentic persuasion really requires in order for it to be authentic persuasion as opposed to coercion. Beyond this notion of open and honest means, it also requires the perception of free will and choice. So your audience needs to be in a position where they have the perception of free will and choice, meaning they can easily say no to the suggestions that you're making. They are not feeling backed into a corner, that they have no other option, because again, if they do make the choice out of fear or out of a perception that they don't have any other choice, that's not persuasion, that's coercion. So finally, persuasion makes an argument that influences the attitudes, values, and/or behaviors of the audience. Oftentimes we think of persuasion as solely being just about change and getting our audience to do something or to stop doing something, that it's solely about behavior. But persuasion can operate on a very ideological level and in a different way than we might anticipate. So there are working definitions for persuasion. What I'm actually going to have you do, if you have the time, is to watch the supporting clip of Leonardo DiCaprio depicting Jordan Belfort in the film The Wolf of Wall Street. And the question I'd like you to respond to is this persuasion or coercion? And what evidence do you have to support your answer? So beyond the definition of persuasion, we need to talk about hashtag goals for persuasion, because as I alluded to, it is not just about change. So persuasion can be about conversion, which is that big radical notion of change. It can be about modification, which is baby steps. This is encouraging your audience to turn off more of their lights to conserve energy and power. This is encouraging your audience to get a reusable water bottle instead of buying giant flats of Dasani when they go to Costco. These are modification steps. Finally, there's persuasion that has the goal rooted in maintenance. We want you to keep doing what you're doing. So for example, I have this photo of a preacher on the right-hand side of the slide. And for me, as a person of faith, I often think about the experience of going to church, going to your house of worship, going to mosque, going to temple, wherever you connect to that spiritual side of yourself. You're not going there to be persuaded. You are going there to be built up, to be encouraged. Now, while some of us may have had that radical experience of conversion in coming to faith or realizing that we didn't have a spiritual side to us in a traditional sense, the actual act of going to a place of worship is a maintenance goal of persuasion. So beyond the definition and the goals of persuasion, there are three common appeals to persuasion that come to us from our old dead friend Aristotle, and you should likely be familiar with these already. They are ethos, pathos, and logos, or rather ethos, logos, and pathos. So ethos comes down to credibility, and this isn't just about the sources that you integrate into your speech, it is also about who you are as a speaker and your character and whether or not you are perceived as trustworthy and honest to your audience. So credibility and character. Logos has to do with logic and reasoning. What kind of arguments are you putting forth in your speech? How are you developing those claims? What kind of research and support are you bringing into the conversation to demonstrate the foundations of your argument? So reasoning and logic. Finally, my personal favorite is pathos, emotion, or passion. And this is really how you find an emotional connection to the topic and also an emotional connection to your audience, and also how you evoke emotion from your audience to encourage them to see the issue as not just something that matters on a logical level, on an ethical level, but as something that should really impact their heart and the way that they think about other human beings, the way that they think about themselves. And so really talking to and speaking to emotion. So fly by night, ethos, logos, pathos. So beyond those appeals to persuasion, which are designed to help us reach disparate audiences, because the likelihood of you talking to an audience that only responds to emotion or only responds to character and credibility or only responds to logic is very, very, very slim. In fact, we have to try to appeal to our audience on all of those levels in order to better put forth our persuasive message. So how do we do that? How do we build the foundation for that? We have to start by building good arguments, and that starts with Stephen Toulmin's model of argumentation. I learned about this first when I was a debater back in high school, and my debate coach said, if it's not Toulmin's, it's crap. And what he was referring to are these primary tenets of building an argument. So here they are. To build an argument, you will need a claim. This is your assertion. What you believe to be true, what you believe to be moral, what you believe is in need of change, your assertion, your claim. After you've stated that claim, you want to provide a justification for that claim. This is the grounds on which you find your claim. The because, the link that you see between your claim and what's to come next, the data, the relevant, sufficient, and credible evidence. This is the backing to support your claim. So the three questions we're looking at with regard to that data are, is it relevant, is it sufficient, and is it credible or reliable? So these are the base elements to building your argument, combined with ethos, pathos, and logos, identifying what the overall goal of your persuasive speech is. Is it to modify, convert, or maintain? And finally, appealing to your audience through open and honest means and giving them an authentic choice. That is fly by night, our overview of persuasion. Now, if you want more, continue watching the recording because I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into Toulmin's model of argumentation and then give you an example of how to put all these things together. So if you decided to stick with me for our deeper dive, let's talk first about Toulmin's model of argumentation. So initially, in making your claim, what you believe to be true, what you believe to be right or wrong, moral or immoral, what you believe to be in need of change or in need of staying exactly the way it is, we have to make a specific proposition, of which there are three predominant types. So there are propositions or claims of fact, value, and policy. If you make an assertion or a claim of fact, you are arguing that something is a truth. Now, I want to clarify, you're not saying that something is a fact because it is accepted to be a fact. You are still making an argument by making a proposition of fact. So for example, if we look at the photo on the slide, I could make the argument that secondhand smoke is detrimental to young children. I am arguing a fact, I am arguing a truth. I could also argue that, for example, the sky is green. It doesn't necessarily need to be a fact, it doesn't necessarily need to be the truth, but I am going to argue the truth. Now, of course, we're abiding in the open, honest, and ethical version of persuasion, so I'm really not going to try to make the claim that the sky is green. All that to say, let's talk about claims of value. A claim of value has to do with these scales of justice in terms of what we believe to be right or wrong, moral or immoral. So topics like abortion, the death penalty, these are classic hotbed propositions and claims of value. So when we make a claim of value, we are arguing that something should be done, something should change because it is immoral, because it is right or wrong, and it appeals to that collective sense of values. So finally, we make propositions of policy. And propositions of policy are probably the most straightforward to understand. Here, we're arguing that something is in need of significant change. So if you think about this example of a school dress code, for example, on the left side, we have what you shouldn't wear. On the right side, we have what is acceptable to wear. But if you argue in your persuasive speech that something is in need of a significant change, you are making a proposition or a claim of policy. So these three pieces are how we put TOULMIN'S model and the first step, making a claim, into practice. After we've made our claim, we want to provide a warrant or a justification. The justification is what links the data to the claim. This is our why. So how do we do this? Because of the three pieces of TOULMIN'S model, this is probably the trickiest. So I'm going to give you what I feel like are a few tips and tricks to put this into practice in your persuasive speech. So try to root your justification in an appeal to common shared values. So where might we find the language, the vocabulary to talk about common shared values? The 8 key questions that were provided to you during your orientation here are a great place to start. Thinking about fairness, outcomes, responsibilities, character, liberty, empathy, authority, and rights. These are a common language, shared values that you can use to connect your claim to the data, the evidence that you're going to provide. Beyond that, as you're making your warrant or justification, this is often where folks make pretty big mistakes with regard to logical fallacies. So we want to take care to avoid those common logical fallacies like the bandwagon, ad hominem, and slippery slope fallacy. Bandwagon, for instance, is also referred to as ad populum. This is relying on the popular opinion as opposed to real, credible facts, research, and information. So if I make my claim and I support it by saying, he knows it, she knows it, everybody knows it, that doesn't actually prove my claim to be true. I've just fallen on a logical fallacy, the bandwagon one. After bandwagon, another common logical fallacy is ad hominem. This is also referred to as the name-calling fallacy. When you try to refute an argument that is presented to you or a claim that is presented to you, and instead of digging into the data, digging into fallacies within the warrant or justification of your opponent's argument, and you instead attack their character, for example, calling them, I don't know, a nasty woman. This is classic logical fallacy, classic ad hominem attack, and it does nothing to provide a warrant or justification, but instead destabilizes your credibility as a speaker overall. Finally, slippery slope. This is the logical fallacy that if this happens, then of course this is going to happen. And we don't necessarily see a relationship between those two things. If you think back to the year 2013, which is when the Defense of Marriage Act, or DOMA, was overturned, allowing same-sex couples to legally marry under the law, a lot of folks argued in response to this decision that if we allowed gay folks to get married, then people would want to marry their animals. They would want to marry their houses and inanimate objects. Well, it's been about 7 years since the overturn of DOMA, and I don't think there's a lot of evidence to support that claim, mostly because it was rooted in the warrant of slippery slope logical fallacy. So warrant is the justification, the thing that links your claim to the why. Finally, the data, the reasons and evidence to support your claim. As you are encountering research and data and investigating sources of information, please, for the love of Peter, ask these 3 very simple questions. 1, is it reliable? That means, is this article credible, accurate, and consistent? 2, is it sufficient? Is the data here enough to prove the claim that's being put forth? Or do I possibly need to find other source material that also reinforces the data I'm finding in this piece? Finally, does it follow? So this is a little bit trickier to grasp, this question, does it follow? What we're thinking about is whether or not the information is relevant, not only to our topic and to our project and to our research, but also do the arguments within that article or within that research follow the claims that are being made to a logical conclusion? So it's sort of like thinking about Aristotle's appeals to persuasion, ethos, pathos, and logos within the context of the research itself, and digging into that logos piece in particular. Do these arguments make sense, or are they relying on some of the logical fallacies we talked about in the previous slide? So these 3 questions to help us vet the data that we find to ultimately support our claims using TOULMIN'S model. So let's put this into practice really quickly. I want to show you a graph that originated from the organization Americans United for Life. And I'm not choosing this because of a particular view, a particular partisan perspective that I have, but because I'd really love for you to ask some of the questions that I included on the previous slide about this graph. So I'm not a mathematician. I am not a math scholar. I know that there are plenty of you in this classroom that know a heck of a lot more about math than I do. But even so, there's just something about this graph that seems a little fishy to me. So I'm trying to look at where the lines on this graph intersect. And if I remember correctly, there's supposed to be a relationship between those 2 data points. But one of the things I notice is at the top of the red line that's trying to illustrate the increase in abortion services that were provided by the organization Planned Parenthood. Certainly there was an increase between 2006 and 2013, but even at that highest point, I feel like that arrow should still be lower than the number of cancer screenings and prevention services that took place in 2013, which is still way more than the number of abortions that were provided. So it's tricky the way that this data is presented. So how can we break apart some of these data concerns? We might talk about the notion of hasty generalization. If I'm trying to use this graphic to assert that the organization Planned Parenthood has offered more abortions than it has cancer screenings and prevention services, I could certainly make that argument and show that there's been an increase, but this graph is probably not the way to get there. Also, the statistics here seem improbable. The way that they're organized is pretty inflammatory, trying to make my audience visualize something and visualize a connection that's not necessarily there. If I had taken these numbers and appropriated them more accurately, I could have still demonstrated that there was an increase in this particular service and that there was a decrease in the number of screenings and preventative services. But this particular imagery doesn't necessarily seem probable or likely. And finally, reliability. Is there a biased stakeholder to attend to? If we think about why it might be problematic to include a source like Americans United for Life in a conversation about the business practices, funding, and services that an organization like Planned Parenthood provides, it seems to me that Americans United for Life has a stake in the outcome of this conversation. And so they're probably not value neutral on this front. I could find this data and present it from a different source and gain a little bit more credibility back as a speaker. So thinking about and vetting our data. Finally, let's put it together. This is an example to kind of take all the different pieces of persuasive speaking and the parts of TOULMIN'S model and bring it together in a conversation about public school dress codes. Okay, so our topic that we've landed on is school dress codes, thinking specifically about public schools and K through 12 education. The goal of my speech, or my group speech in this case, is modification. We're not trying to spark radical conversion to eradicate dress codes entirely. We're not asking to maintain existing dress code standards. We are instead asking for baby steps, changes within the policy itself. So, the claim that I might make is school dress codes are sexist. So I am arguing here a truth. It does not need to be something that is accepted as fact. I am going to argue that it is a fact, making a proposition of fact. Beyond my claim, I make my warrant. This is where I try to link together my claim and my eventual data to come and appeal to a common language of shared values. In this case, I've chosen fairness. So because they place an unfair burden on female presenting students. Finally, data. In a meta-analysis of 500 public school dress codes, over half contained more rules pertaining to the dress of female presenting students than to the dress of male presenting students. So this is my inclusion of relevant evidence to bring my claim in conversation to my warrant. So continuing on with my same persuasive goal of modification within this topic of school dress codes, how am I appealing to ethos, pathos, and logos? So initially, ethos, thinking about credibility and character. And that it's not just the sources that I cite, it's also who I am when I speak. So I am an educator, a former public school student, and I identify as female. So there are ways in which my audience can perceive me to be trustworthy and credible on this topic. Beyond ethos, in terms of logos, I'm thinking about this from a causal reasoning perspective, or an if-then kind of reasoning. So if the dress code proves a disproportionate burden to half or more of the student body, then it should be changed. So this is the way in which I'm going to try to appeal to logos to meet my audience in that particular sphere. Finally, pathos. I am going to choose to share a personal story about being pulled out of class for wearing a tank top and then missing an entire day's worth of content. I could also choose at this point to poll my audience to gain their perspective and hear the specific narratives of any feminine presenting folks that are listening to my speech and bring in their experiences as well. So meeting my audience with ethos, logos, and pathos. So that's it. Putting together the basics of persuasion to present my audience a reasonable argument that is supported with fact, value, or policy claims appealing to ethos, pathos, and logos. All right, if you have questions or comments, please let me know. Otherwise, thanks for listening.